Good morning,
Recorded
everybody.
inquiry.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the virtual show and welcome to our session with Nick Dunhill, who will be building a chassis, I hope. Just to let you know that we are being recorded. If you do not wish to be visible, you can turn your video off. And I note that some of the participants have done that. If you would remain muted, I'd appreciate it. And then I think with the numbers we have at the moment, I'd be very happy for people to unmute to ask Nick a question directly. If you want to use the chat, then please do so as well, and I will ask questions. And the chat is available at the bottom of your screen if you're on a PC and somewhere else if you're not. So without further ado, let's introduce Nick Dunhill. Good morning, Nick.
Morning, James. Morning, everyone. So here we are at the Gauge Your Guild show, virtual show 2023. And this morning we're going to be working a little bit more on this, which is a scratch build model of a Lancashire and Yorkshire something or other, Kirtley C-class, that I've been building on and off in all of the An Evening With presentations that you might have seen. They're all there to be seen on the Guild website if you haven't seen any of them. And I started a year or two ago in lockdown by making the smoke box, and then followed that a little bit later by making the boiler, and then the footplate here, and the cab. And finally, in the last presentation, we made a scratch-built chassis, which is here. And today, we're going to put the wheels in it and make it work, hopefully. You have to bear in mind, this is a live presentation, so what could possibly go wrong? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll switch you over to me overhead camera. Give me a second. Click. Is it working? Yes, it is. Hello, everybody. Can you see me? Is that okay with the light on? Right. Is that working, James, with the light?
It is. It's slightly blurred. I don't know whether there's a focus issue, is there?
Is that better? We better there?
Yeah, your hands are better.
Let me see if I can get phone to focus. There we go. Anyway, so we're going to put the chassis in today. Now, originally when I designed this chassis, the front driving wheel hole here for the bearing was just a circular hole, because originally that was going to be the driven wheel. But the briefs changed slightly. I had a word with the fella I'm making this for, saw it in the last presentation and decided that he might like to have inside valve gear, which would mean therefore we have to drive the rear axle here. So what I've done is I've cut out a slot there to accept a Slater's horn block, which is these little square things here that come with Slater's horn guide sets, but if you ring them, they will sell you the brass axle boxes separately. And the dimensions of this hole are such that the slot that's in this bearing runs in the frame there. And to locate the axle boxes, you can see what I've done here is I have cut out some thin pieces of brass angle and soldered them here and here around the axle box to act as horn cheeks to kind of locate the axle box and allow it to move up and down, but with absolutely no forward to back side plate, absolutely none. And you can see that I've already done a little piece of prep, and I've put the axle box and the horn cheeks in for the rear drivers. And what I've made to start with is these. Now these are just a 1.5 times 1.5 piece of brass angle that's had a little strip of 0.45. Is that 18 thou? Brass planted on the bottom of it. So it's like a seat now, isn't it, with a fat base and a thin back. And I've drilled a hole in it and tapped it out 12BA to accept a little 12BA screw there, which we can use as a height adjuster and then solder in place and then cut off, which we'll do a bit later if we get time and I remember. So I've already done those and located the axle boxes for the rear driving axle. And what we're going to do now is we're going to fit the front driving wheel axle boxes here. But first, before we do that, we have to do a little bit of prep on the coupling rods. Now, these are the pair of coupling rods for the Loco, and you probably, if you saw the last video, you would see that I cheated. These aren't scratch built. They're made from some etchings that I had done. I had some etchings done for something else, and I bought the guy who does the CAD work a pint, and he put me these some etchings for these rods in the corner of something else that he was sending off to the etchers. And they're just copied off the drawing that we have here, and they're just made up in the conventional way. As I remember, there are 2 laminations here for the main part of the rod, and then an overlay on each side of the boss to thicken up the boss as the ones on the real Loco are. And then you kind of flood them with solder and spend ages and ages and ages filing and polishing them to make them look as if Billy Connell machined them. So that's those. And before we start, what we need to do is we need to open out the holes in the rod to accept a Slater's crank pin bearing, like this one here, balancing on my finger. And how I do this, I mean, this isn't a definitive way of doing it. This is just how I do it. I've got here, look, in my pin chuck, a tapered pin reamer. And somewhere up the length of this reamer is the working size for these little bearings. So what I've done is I've put the reamer into the hole and started reaming material out of the rod until you get to the point at which the bearing just slips in really nicely. No side play at this stage. In fact, no side play at all if we're lucky. And you can see then what I've done is I've marked that position on the reamer with a piece of tape, so I know how far to push the reamer through the tapered reamer through the rod, through the hole. And then, of course, when you've done that, turn it over and do the other side as well. And while you're reaming away, you want to make sure that the I'll do a little bit more on this one because this is the only hole that hasn't been done. And you can see I better put a little bit of oil on the reamer. Give us a second. A little bit of cutting compound. So while I'm reaming away, winding the reamer into the crank pin journal, you'll see I'm turning it quite slowly, and I'm trying to make sure at all times that the rod's at 90 degrees to the reamer, and also here is also at 90 degrees to the reamer. So I'm trying to get a perpendicular hole through the rod. And what we're going to do is we're going to wind this really slowly till we get to the piece of tape, and then we know that all of the holes in both rods are the same diameter, and then we've got a fighting chance of making the chassis work. And this does, with a rod like this with quite a fat boss, it does take a little bit of patience to work your tired old reamer through the hole. There we go, we're just coming up to the piece of tape now. So I'm going to stop there, just check that everything's square, and it is. So we'll just, because it's tapered, we'll just pop it in that side. Just ream that out as well. So that's that job done. Let's get all that swarf off me reamer. And then I've got a nice big drill here just to get the burr off the hole. There we go, like that. So now what we've got is a pair of rods, and all the rods I've got a hole in them that's the working diameter for that, one of those Slater's crank pin bushes. So ready now to offer these up into the chassis. But before we do that, let me put this bearing on that crank pin, on this Slater's wheel set, so that I'm not searching around for it later. It's inevitably to happen, isn't it, if you don't put it where you want it to be. Why can't I get this nut? Right. We'll come back to the Slater's wheels later. Right. So, better start soldering things into the chassis. So, this is part of the horn guide, the top part with the screw through it that I haven't yet soldered into the chassis. So I think that's where we should start. So if we put this in the chassis, above the cutout for the axle box, put that there where we need it.
That component you're fitting, Nick, where has that come from? Have you scratch built it?
I've made it, yeah. It's just made from a piece of angle.
Yeah.
Brass angle. That's been, it's had a strip planted on the bottom to make the bottom part of the angle thicker. And then it's had a hole drilled through it there.
Yeah.
1.1 millimeter, and it's been tapped 12 BA.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So something like that's 2 millimeter 2x2 angle or 3x3?
1.5 by 1.5.
Oh, with a 1.1 hole through it.
Yeah. There's not a lot of
not a lot spare.
Not a lot spare there, no.
Okay.
But enough. Right, so I've kind of positioned that, though you probably can't see it because of the way that the orientation is, and I'm just going to put a dab of flux on there. Solder that to the chassis. Yeah, lovely. You know what? I could have got that square if I'd have tried a bit harder as well. Let's just move that around so it's square. Warm it all up. Budge it a little bit. There we go. There we go. That's nice and square. And we'll just drop a tap down through the hole just in case any solder found its way into the tapped hole there. So we'll just pop a 12 BA tap back through the hole, clear it all out of any solder. And in my little box here, I've got a little piece of 12 BA studding that I cut earlier to act as a little screw by which we can check the ride height later. So that's that installed. We'll clean all this up later off camera in between the two presentations. Right, so what we need are 2 axle boxes, but not that one because it's got a blob of solder on it from somewhere. And I'm going to use these. Now they're jewelry axles, and these came from metalsmiths donkeys years ago, but I know other people sell them. I know markets sell them. And the idea of them is that you put them into the axle boxes, like so. And then they come with a nice, really soft spring. Oh, I'll tell you what we do before we push the spring into the chassis. We'll solder a piece of waste brass material across the frame just there temporarily, just to brace the frame while we put the spring in, because of course the spring's going to try and spread the frame straight away. So what we'll do is we'll just tack a little bit of waste across there to stop the frame spreading out when we pop this spring in. You'll see what we're doing in a second. So what I've done is I've put one of the axle boxes on either end of this axle and a spring in the middle. And we're going to slot that into the frame like that. So the springs holding the axle boxes, the brass axle boxes in place. Now, what we're going to do then is we're going to put a rod over the pointy ends of these dummy axles, these jury axles, like that. And like that. And when we've done that, we're going to get a Sharpie. And we're going to put R on that one. And L on this one. So that when all this falls apart, when we finish soldering, we'll know which rod went on which side. Now, hear you asking, why is he doing that? Well, I've looked at lots of model railway chassis that people have brought to me down the years saying it doesn't work, it binds. And this is the method I use to make sure that you don't get any binding at all. Usually when a chassis binds, it's because the centers of the holes in the rods don't match the wheel bearing centers. Now, if you use the rods as a jig to locate the axle boxes, then the centers will match and your locomotive will not bind. At least that's the theory. Now, you can see what I did when I cut these slots in the frames is I made them slightly bigger than they need to be to accept bearings. Because, of course, the bearings will find their own centres as soon as you attach the rods to the outer sides of them. Now, somewhere on the table here, look, I've got an elastic band that will just pop over there just to stop the rod falling off. Like so. Right, now the next thing we need to do before we start soldering is to adjust the height of the axle boxes in the frame so that the rod is parallel to the frame. Now, we don't really have to adjust them to the working height yet, so long as all of the axle boxes are the same. So, I already did this before you came this morning, and I've set my vernier look to the bottom of the chassis and to the bottom of the axle. So what we're going to do is we're going to offer that up to them. We're going to see that the bearing's sitting too low in the chassis, so we'll pop a little tiny screwdriver into the slot I cut in the top of the piece of studding. Wind that down. And check it again. And it needs to go a little bit further down. Up, I'm sorry, frame. So turn that. And we'll turn this one as well, because that's way too far down. And you just have to bear with it. This is quite a tedious iterative process. But it will result in a perfectly running chassis. Now that is pretty much right. And that one needs a tiny bit more. And you can tell when you look at the sharp side of the chassis, because you can see by eye that the rod is roughly parallel to the flat bit at the bottom of the chassis. That's going to need a tiny bit more, maybe quarter of a turn out to raise the axle box. Yep, that's good. Right, so now what we've got is we've got all of the axle boxes in the frame. Both axles are parallel, and if you sight a line down there, you can see that the axles are parallel. And if you look that way, you can see that the rod is horizontal with the chassis. So that's all good. So I'm confident now that the rods are in the right place. Of course, the rod crank pin holes, and now going to have located these two axle boxes in the right place. So the geometry of this chassis is now right for these bearings and those rods. So we should be able to solder the horn cheeks in to locate them. What I've done here, look, is I've pre-cut more little sections of 1.5 by 1.5 angle. Oh, you can't see that phone, I won't focus on it. So they're ready to go. And we're going to get a pair of my holy bits of wood, stand the chassis on its end. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to check by eye actually first that the axle boxes are square and aren't rotating. So there, the square axle box is roughly square. Well, by eye. The only way you can do this really is by eye. And square in the chassis, and then we'll get a piece of angle, pop that there, very, very gently, trying not to disturb anything.
Do you pre-tin those, Nick?
Nope.
Oh.
No, I don't pre-tin stuff.
Okay.
It's probably not a bad idea to pre-tin them. So just put a little bit of flux on there. We have to do this quite quickly because what you don't want, of course, is to solder the axle box to the axle box, the horn guide, the horn cheek, sorry. So quick dab with the soldering iron, and that's one in. And then we'll move on to do the one on the other side. Again, just locate that with a little jeweler's screwdriver and just hold it gently in place, pushing it very gently up against the square axle box. And we'll just tack that as well, like that.
The solder is normal 145 solder?
Normal 145 solder, and I'm using a liquid flux.
Okay.
That's just phosphoric acid, standard sort of soft solder flux, and I'm applying it with a high-tech applicator that's 2 cocktail sticks taped together. Only the best kit in my workshop. And you can see the axle box is still free to move vertically, but there's no side-to-side movement in it, which is exactly what we want. So we can move on to the one at the other side. And again, we'll stick the horn cheek there up against the axle box, trying to get it level with the bottom of the chassis and just touching the top piece that we soldered in a minute ago. I mean, of course, you could go and buy some kind of proprietary Slater's axle box to do this. They sell brass ones that you can fold up and solder into place.
Well, actually, Nick,
they sell cast ones as well, don't they?
They don't do the etch one anymore.
Do they not? Have they discontinued?
No, they've stopped doing them.
All right, okay. I mean, I struggled with those for years. They're kind of a bit difficult to fold up accurately. But a lot of the manufacturers actually put a pre-etched hole, a pre-etched slot, don't they, in chassis?
Yeah.
And I think they're designed for those Slaters etched axle boxes, aren't they? So you cut the piece out and the axle box just drops in. But even so, I still recommend that never rely on the etched holes. In fact, even if you're building a blind chassis, one that's not got compensation, a fixed chassis, I would still make the connecting rods first and use those as a jig to locate the axle boxes accurately, because that's always why chassis never run, because the centers don't match, and they haven't got a chance if the centers don't match. Anyway, let's put the fourth one in. This is going to be a short presentation, this, isn't it? Because I've virtually done. No accidents, everybody. Nothing soldered to anything else. No burns, no cuts, no blood. Oh, very good. Right. Piece of solder there. So, as you can see, now what we've got is both axle boxes located in place. We've got this brass piece, angle piece soldered in here with a screw adjuster to adjust the height of the ride height of the chassis. And then we've got these brass pieces of angle soldered into place to stop the axle box rotating and moving laterally in the frame. And the same on the other side. Of course, the rods have dictated the centres of the axle boxes, so this chassis now should be good to go. However, we do have a few adjustments to make first before we can start playing around with the Slater's wheels. So let's take this elastic band off that we used to locate everything. And you can now see that this slides really nicely in the chassis. I'm confident that the centres there are spot on. So I'm going to take the rods off, and so that it still says right and left in Sharpie, but what I'm going to do is get a scriber and just scribe it on the back of the rod, because that's a little bit more permanent, isn't it? That's the right hand one. This is the left hand one. So we know forever which side of the loco to put them on. Right, let's pull out the axle, get rid of that spring, because we don't need that anymore. Take that axle out. Right, now what I'm going to do is I'm also going to make sure that this axle box goes back into the chassis in the same orientation, just in case there is any slight variation in the sizes of these. And what I always do, this is just personal habit, is I just centre pop part of the bottom of the axle box. So I know now the bit with the centre punch in it is the bottom, and this is the left-hand side axle box. So I'll just score a little L there in the axle box, so we know when they accidentally drop out later which axle box goes into which hole and in which orientation. So we know that everything's going back into the chassis in the way that it was all set up. Again, we put a little centre pop on the bottom, and we'll just scribe a R on this for right. I know this is all a bit tedious, but it's kind of good practice, isn't it? And we can break that off. Chuck that in the scrap box.
As a matter of interest, Nick, what's the distance from outside of frame to outside of frame? What's the width of the frame?
This or the internal?
Yeah. No, the outside.
This?
Yeah.
That's a good question, but I have just the tool here for measuring that.
And is this aimed at fine scale?
Well, this is always a pub discussion that we have, isn't it? This is 26.8.
Okay.
Now I know that if you buy a commercial chassis, they tend to be a lot narrower than this, don't they? And this is kind of one of those perennial issues, really, with fine scale, is that of course it's much the wheel back to backs, and therefore the gauge of the track's a fair bit smaller, isn't it, than prototypical.
Yes.
I can't remember what's the difference between scale 7 and fine scale. Fine scale's 32, isn't it? And scale 7, 33 point something.
But yes, I think it's about one and a bit millimeters.
Yeah.
Not much.
That's what I think it is. But of course, if you were to build this, even if you were building in scale 7, if you were building this and you use the prototypical frame space in here, the back of the wheel would be very close to the frame.
Yeah.
Because real loco, you can only really get your hand behind the back of the wheel, can't you? There isn't a massive gap between the frame and the wheel. And in fact, often when you see a chassis in a workshop somewhere off a real loco, off the real railway, you'll often see gouge marks around the chassis, won't you, where the tires have actually touched the frames of the loco while it's been running, which of course we can't have, can we, when we're electrifying our locos? So we have to be pragmatic, don't we, and make the frame slightly narrower. But the problem with that is, especially with locos like this, is that you have part of the chassis that sticks out above the frame. So if you were to put this chassis in the frame like that, you can see the way I've designed it. I've designed it with this section of the chassis that sticks up above the footplate. Like so. So you can see here, look, there's a section here of the chassis that's sticking up. Now, often in kits, the chassis ends at the bottom of the footplate, and this is a piece that you plant on, isn't it? But I kind of don't like that, because when you look under the boiler, you'll see the chassis kind of stepped, isn't it, halfway up? And I don't know, I don't like that. So what I always do is I make the frame above the footplate the same width as the chassis, and I try to make the chassis as wide as you possibly can. And that helps you out as well when you're trying to fit things like inside valve gear, because there's a little bit more room between the axle boxes to get the crank webbing and all the pile of eccentrics that need to go in there as well, because that can be a little bit close, you know, in fine scale.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I'm building a chassis for a 700, which is also going to have inside valve gear, and like you, I've made the chassis outside width
a bit wider,
26.7.
Yeah. And these
you need that space inside. I'm just surprised you've put the bearings in the way round you have, with the round bit sticking outwards.
Yeah, well, I'll show you why I'm doing that in a minute.
Go on, then.
That's the next calculation. So obviously now we need to get the wheel sets in the chassis, and so we know that the back-to-backs of fine scales 29.2 because it's burned into my memory. And if you were to just measure this using my verniers, you can see that these now, this distance between the circular bits, the outside extensions, is 31.8. So I can find my calculator. So 31.8 minus 29.2 equals 2.6. So if we divide that by 2, then we need to take 1.3 millimeters. So we'll make a note of that, 1.3 millimeters off the thickness of that dimension of each of these axle boxes. And then when we put the wheel sets in, the axle box will take up the end float. You don't need to put any shims in there to shim out the end float. And because this is only a two-coupled engine, a 240 engine, we really don't need any end float at all on the driving wheels, because the wheelbase is really quite short, and we'll get a little bit of end float on the I don't know what kind of whether it's not a radial truck, I don't really know what you would call it, on the front axle anyway. We'll get a little bit of end float on that, so that hopefully the chassis will go around a 6-foot radius curve. And if we get time, we'll get the test track out and just show maybe in the second presentation that it will go around the 6-foot radius curve, and we'll invent some fancy way of locating the front wheel. But for now, we need to muck about with this, and we need to reduce the width of these bearings so that they'll locate the front driving wheel. So these bearings are 4.8. I'm sure that's an imperial equivalent, but these are 4.8 millimeters. So we need to take 1.3 off each, which will leave 4 is 3. So what we need to do is we need to file or turn part of this circular part of the bearing off so that the width becomes 3.5 from 4.8, which is quite a lot. And you can see I've already done that with the rear bearings, and you can see how much you have to take off. It is quite a lot. And this is quite a tedious part of the presentation because I don't have a lathe. So I'm going to do it by hand, but I'm not going to file it. I'm going to use a sanding disc. Now I make these myself, and they're bits of fairly coarse, wet and dry that I've stuck double-sided tape to the back of, drawn round to make some circles and cut them out. Stick them to the arbor, the rubber arbor that I use. Put that in the mini drill. And how are we doing for time? Oh, we're about sort of 2/3 of the way through, aren't we?
Yeah.
I didn't think I'd get this far, you see, so I was going to do this bit off camera between the two presentations, but while you're here, we might as well do it. So this is quite a tedious job. You can see I'm holding it in my fingernails and just rotating the sanding disc on the bearing. Now, all of you people that have a lathe with a 4-jaw chuck are going to be recoiling in horror at what I'm doing here.
To be honest, it'd be quite difficult to get that accurately lined up.
Because you're going to say to me, how on earth are you going to make that square? Well, you do it by eye. So that's 4.4. So there's we'll take 0.4 off. So we need to take another fairly hefty chunk off that. So
I love the way you do it in your fingers.
maybe one day I'll buy a lathe. I used to have a Unimat, but it wasn't mine and it had to go back when I left my employment at Manchester University. They kind of loaned it to me, although I don't think they realised they'd loaned it to me at the time. But to be fair, it did go back when I left. So what I'm doing, as you can see, is I'm kind of, from time to time, rotating the bearing by 90 degrees between my fingernails. And I'm just eyeballing it. I know that's terrible engineering practice, but kind of works. Let's measure that. So we're now down to, ooh, look, 3.6. So we've got another smidge. We need to do a smidge and a bit actually, because there does need to be a tiny bit of end float, just to make sure it doesn't bind. I think that might be it. Let's have a look. There we go, look, 3.5, spot on. I'll get a nice chunky drill from over there just to clean the swarf out of that. Maybe a bit of blue roll just to grinding bits out of that. There we go. Put that back in the frame. And we're going to do the same with the other one. You lucky people, you're going to watch me do the same thing again. This is quite poor value for money, isn't it? Watching me grind things down with a sanding disc.
While we're at this point, everyone, does anyone have questions for Nick while he's doing this really interesting part of the process? If you would like to unmute and ask him a question, please do. Other thing, Nick, what's the thickness of material you use for the side frames?
Come again, sorry.
The thickness of the material you use for the frames.
Oh, that's 0.45. Is that 18th thou in imperial measurements?
Oh, could be.
Is it 18th thou? It's 0.45 anyway. It's a pretty standard thickness that O gauge kits tend to be etched in. And you might make a case that it's a little bit thin. But I mean, it's braced to death. And it's going to be braced a little bit more because in a future presentation, I'm going to make an ash pan that'll fit just here between the frames, and that'll be soldered to the frames, and that'll make the frames really rigid. It'll stop it doing that completely.
So, yeah. 18th thou, you're right.
The what? Sorry.
18th thou, yes.
It's 0.45.
Yes.
Yeah, thought so. Sorry. Back on with a little bit more grinding.
It's actually a reasonable thickness for the Slater's bearings, because you do want, the slot in the Slater's bearing is actually quite narrow.
The what? Sorry.
The slot in the Slater's bearing is actually quite narrow, isn't it?
It is. I can measure it for you if you like.
Go on then.
It is 0.8. Well, it's 0.82 or something like that. So again, it's going to be, in David White, that'll be the equivalent of a 32th or a 64th or something like that, won't it? Whatever measurements it is that you use. I could never get on with imperial measurements, because if you were to get a piece of paper and write down 7/16 or 9/32 or
30 seconds
64ths or 8/32 or whatever, then in my head I couldn't really put them in order, you know what I mean? And you're constantly having to do that thing with imperial measurements where you're flipping between fractions and thousandths, and people like my dad who've done it for years it's just there in their head, but it's not in mine. So
yeah.
I kind of work in metric, and I think that makes it a little bit easier. I'm going to say that of course you're lifting measurements off a drawing. If you're using 7 mil to a foot, then the measurements that you lift off a drawing end up being in millimeters anyway, don't they? So it's much easier to work in millimeters, and that's my rationale. But all my drills are all in millimeters. This is a 9mm one for the record. In fact, it's not, it's 9.5. Right, so there you go. So they're all set now to 3.5mm, which we calculated there. You can see we've got a pretty tidy pile of swarf there that I'll just get rid of and put in the bin over there. And if we get the measuring stick, we should have 29.2 or thereabouts. And we have, look, ooh, it is 29 dead.
Perfect.
So that's 0.2. So that's, I'll call that a win. So now we need to put us Slater's wheels, don't we, in the frames. So perhaps it's worth spending a minute going through how I deal with these. I know a lot of people dread them a little bit, but I think they're pretty good for what you pay.
Yeah.
And I know some people like their Alan Harris, or what's he called, the new guy that does the scale, used to do gauge 1 wheels that now does O gauge ones that are exquisite.
Is it Martin Wood?
Yeah, it is Martin Wood. Thank you. But these actually, I think, are quite a good compromise between price and effectiveness. So anyway, I always had to talk. They've always got a little bit of or they sometimes have like a little injection molding mark there, which kind of start by chopping off with a scalpel. And the other ones. And you always get this nice little packet that's got a axle and some crank pin bearings and a screw. And try not to flip the contents all over the workshop. And you always get these nice little packets as well that really come in useful for storing stuff in. So I'll put that one in my drawer for another day with the other 50 odd that are in there. I'll get the axle. And again, I think you need to look away if you're a precision engineer. What is try to get these. One of the other problems. Oh, look at that! That one's slotted in perfectly. Is to get the square end of the axle to locate in the wheel quite nicely, but quite tightly, and really nice sliding engineering fit, and that's good. The one on this side is also good, so that's a bit lucky. But even so, I'm just going to dress the corners just to get any burrs off them, so it will be a nice sliding fit. Like so. And maybe a little bit off these sharp corners as well. Just a quick, nothing much. Just to knock the burr off the corner, because these will have been done on a CNC machine and it will have left a burr. And they churn them out by the hundreds, so they won't have been dressed by hand. So that fits nicely in that one. And nicely in that one. So we do have quite a nice pair of wheels here from Slater's. The next thing I always do is just to get the muck off the tyres, just stick an axle in the mini drill. Put a wheel on. And then just give it a bit of a spin and a rub with some very fine wet and dry. Just to get the, don't know whether David White, whether his staff oil these lightly when they put them in the packets, but they're just made out of mild steel. And I think it's a good idea just to give them a little light polish with some, you know, fine wet and dry. Make them look a bit more presentable. It'll look a lot nicer when you just had a little rub.
There have been occasions I've found where the tyres can actually be quite rusty.
Sorry?
There have been occasions where the tyres I've found been quite rusty.
Well, I went to his factory a couple of years ago when it was when he had that flood. I was there on the morning of the flood, and when I turned up, there were all of their books, ledgers, and things on the wall outside in the sunshine, and the wind drying out. And he came out, David, and he said, "All right, what do you want?" And I said, "Oh, I've come for some wheels back. And see, it might not be convenient." So, and he said, "No, I'll give you some wheels." So we waded into his workshop, into the warehouse part of his industrial unit, and it was underwater. And bless him, he took the trouble to dig me out the wheels I needed for the job I was just about to start. So wheels for 2 locos, actually. And they were soaked. They were sat in those little bin trays that you get in warehouses, full of water, and all the cardboard packaging was all saturated, and the wheels were all, as you say, they were just starting to go a bit rusty. So I just went to a cafe in the Peak District and just took them all out of the packet and put them on the wall in the sunshine to dry, while I was having a coffee. And I was on my motorcycle, by the way, and I'd shoved them all in the pocket of my motorbike, and the pocket was damp. Anyway, on with the wheels. What I'm going to do is I actually quite like using these 12BA screws that you get with the wheels, because I had a bit of a nightmare once in the past where I tried fitting some of those what's it called, Grundy high. They're much more kind of that, what would you call them, heavy duty crank pin nuts. And I kind of tried drilling out these holes to accept the Derek Mundy crank pin sets, and I lost the centers, completely lost the centers, and trashed the wheels, and had to go and buy new wheels. So I've always been utterly paranoid about drilling out these Slater's wheels since. So I just use the 12BA nuts, and I've always found them to be okay if you're careful how you set them up. Anyway, so we're going to put the screw into the hole, but first we're going to make a rebate in the back of the wheel to accept the head of the screw, so it's not sticking out at the back of the wheel, clonking on things as it goes round. So I've got I think this is a 1/8 drill. So I've literally 3 turns so that you can recess the screw head in the back of the wheel. Like that. And then sometimes these just push through. Sometimes the holes are very slightly undersized and you can screw them in, which is quite useful. And then when they're nearly in, you always get a blob of super glue on the end of the screw. And then they're in there pretty permanently, I think. I'll just do the other one. Again, a few turns by hand with a drill, just check that the hole is deep enough in the back of the wheel. Bit more. There we go. Again, start screwing. Screwdriver, a little bit of super glue, little dab of super glue there on the back. Screw those in. Lift them up a bit, wipe the excess glue off. That's the crank pin screws installed. Now, the other thing I have noticed about Slater's wheels is that sometimes, not every time, but sometimes, the screws that you've just put in for the crank pins come through not at 90 degrees to the face of the wheel. I don't know whether you can see that, but they're not on these. They've gone through the hole at an angle. I don't know whether that's because of the way that I've screwed them in, or maybe the holes, the injection molding process makes the hole through the wheel at an angle. I don't know. But anyway, what I always do is true them up by getting my rule and laying it across the brass bush in the middle of the wheel, and then getting a pliers and just tweaking the screw so that that's 90 degrees, which it is there to the little brass insert there in the middle of the wheel. If you just lay your rule across that, you can get a nice right angle there with the crank pin. And then if you lay the rule across the rim of the tyre like that, the rule's got lines etched onto it, and you can line those up with the steel screw just to make sure it's at 90 degrees to the face of the wheel in that plane as well. I might need to tiny tweak that way. So needs a bit more. Quite good there. I mean, the reason for doing this is that when the wheels rotate, and if these if the crank pins aren't at 90 degrees to the face of the wheel, then the bearing will describe a cone like that as the wheel's going round, and it will bind in the holes in your coupling rods. And the worst thing you can do is open out the holes in the coupling rods to compensate for that, because the sloppier it gets, the more chance that the damn thing will bind. So I'd avoid that at all costs. Right. So that's okay in that plane. It's okay in that plane. So I'm going to pass that one out to the quality control workshop. Need to tweak. Not that much of a tweak. A bit more. Just gripping the screw very gently with the pliers so that I don't knacker the thread on it. That's good. Good in that plane. It's good in that plane as well. So I'm not gonna sign that one. So anyway, whenever I have a Slater's wheel in my hand, I always think of the Grasshopper Cafe in Hope in the Peak District, which is just at it's about 3 or 4 miles away from where David's factory is. And I'm very lucky because the Peak District starts just there, beyond that window. So I can jump on my motorbike and go and get stuff from Slater's whenever I want stuff. Right, so we're in the situation now where all the wheels are kind of all ready to go. And we've got to pretty much the end of this presentation for this morning.
And that really well, Nick.
So what I propose that we do is that I go away and have coffee and a piece of cake. And then while I'm away, while you're off enjoying other things in the show that isn't just televised drilling, televised grinding, we can I can make some balance weights for these wheels, and then this afternoon when we do the presentation we'll fit the wheels into the chassis and get ourselves a rolling chassis, and we'll do something with the front axle boxes and try and locate the front wheel in the frames as well. And if we've got time we'll dig out a bit of test track from behind me and we'll try and get the thing running. That's okay with you. So before I bugger off for me coffee and me cake, does anybody have any questions? I'm going to take that as a no.
Yeah, well, it pretty much reached the end of the session. May I thank Nick very, very much indeed for showing us how he's done this. That's very useful. And we look forward to seeing any of you who would like to see the next stage.
Come back this afternoon.
Our afternoon session, yes. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to close the session now. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the show, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Come back later and we'll do the fixing it into the frames. Although there's no guarantee I won't have just tried it a little, just done a little cheeky check before you come back, just to make sure it does work.
Got just over an hour, Nick. Be quick.
I think I might spend that time having cake. I had an Australian fella came yesterday for 2 broad gauge locos that I've been making, or one that I've been modifying for him. And he brought me some lamingtons all the way from Melbourne. How good's that?
Wow.
We're going to have a big chunk of lamingtons right now.
It's interesting that you're allowed to take food out of Australia. You try getting the stuff in.
I know. I'll tell you a funny story, shall I? I deal with another Australian guy. He makes chimneys and things for me, chimneys and domes, because he's got a mill and a lathe and he knows how to use them. And he's got all the tools and all that kind of stuff. And he also messes around with motorbikes. And in the summer, he got in touch and said, "I've found a gearbox for a squirrel motorbike that I'm doing up. And it costs a fortune to get it sent to Australia, and it costs a fortune as well because you have to clean the gearbox out before you can import it into Australia, and it has to be stripped and cleaned scrupulously, because the Australians like a bit of biosecurity, don't they?" And so he sent the gearbox to me, and then he shoved it in a carrier bag and put it in his one of his cases and took it back to Australia that way in his checked-in luggage. But the guy who sent me one of these broad gauge locos, when I opened up the box, it had grass in it from Australia. So of course I was making this joke that in 6 months' time my garden's going to be full of all these wild Australian grasses, isn't it? Spreading through the neighbourhood.
Love it.